Chapter 5 Extreme Situations. Bruno Bettelheim wrote that, from the moment he came down the gangplank of the SS Gerolstein in 1939, Dachau and Buchenwald, to everybody willing to listen, and to many more unwilling to do so. Despite the pain of recalling his incarceration, he said, he felt duty-bound to the thousands still imprisoned to make as many people as possible aware of the Nazis' calculated inhumanity. But, as has long been well known, even after the war broke out, most Americans refused for many months to believe that the nation of Beethoven and Thomas Mann was capable of the atrocities Bettelheim and others were describing. I was accused of being carried away by my hatred of the Nazis, of engaging in paranoid distortions. I was warned not to spread such lies. His listeners said he was giving us enough to devise and systematically execute such a diabolic system, when everybody knew they were but stupid madmen. Superscript 1 in 1940, hoping that if he could publish his alarm it might prove more persuasive, he began setting down his observations. At the time, little had been written by former inmates about the two camps he had been in. The two principal accounts, Bruno Heilig's Men Crucified and Peter Wallner's By Order of the Gestapo, a record of life in Dachau and Buchenwald concentration camps, were both published in England in 1941 and did not reach a wide readership there, much less in the United States. Bettelheim gave no indication that he had ever read these books. But whether he had or not, their highly personal, heavily anecdotal portraits of camp life, however valuable and moving, did not focus on what interested him most: the psychological impact of the concentration camp experience. The writing went slowly, in part because of the freighted subject, in part because Bettelheim had to fit it in around his busy research and teaching schedules in Chicago and Rockford. He did not finish the paper until 1942, by which time the United States had entered the war, and the Nazi fever was running high, and reports of concentration camp brutality no longer met with quite the disbelief Bettelheim had first encountered. Still, a certain skepticism continued. He wrote later that for well over a year he sent the manuscript to one psychiatric or psychoanalytic journal after another, only to have it rejected. He did not name the journals, or the editors who turned the paper down, but he did list their reasons for doing so. His failure to keep a written record in the camps, his inability either to verify or to replicate his data, or the seeming impact. Bettelheim said that some of these editors added, probably correctly, as judged by my experience when I tried talking about these matters to professional people, that the article would be too unacceptable to their audiences. Squared. The editor who did finally find it acceptable was Gordon W. Allbord, a Harvard psychology professor who had spent time studying in Germany, and whose well-known views on personality emphasized the individual. He also oversaw the Journal of Abnormal and Social Psychology, which published Bettelheim's paper in the fall of 1943, under the title Individual and Mass Behavior in Extreme Situations, cubed in some 20,000 words. The former prisoner sought to show how the concentration camp was not primarily a place where the SS indulged its appetite for random ruthlessness, but a carefully organized and calculatedly cruel operation designed to make the prisoners more useful subjects of the Nazi regime. He said at the outset that it was not his intention to recount once more the horror story of the German concentration camp, with which he assumed his readers were by now roughly familiar. Instead, he was determined to present his case in a scientific fashion. He gave the paper a statistical underpinning, reporting that as a result of sleeping in 5 different barracks he came to know personally at least 1,500 inmates in the 2 camps. As noted, he had in fact slept in only 2 barracks, 1 in each camp. But even if he had been housed in 5, establishing a personal relationship with 1,500 prisoners in 10.5 months would have meant getting to know and interview 5 new inmates every day, in a setting hardly conducive to such research. Whatever the number, the interviewees provided an adequate sampling to study the case material. Bettelheim wrote in the third person. The academic tone made more stilted by his struggle to master the nuances of his new language. He said he took this approach hoping to achieve an objectivity that would disarm those who insisted that he was exaggerating his findings out of a desire for revenge. He also cautioned that he regarded the paper as a preliminary report that did not pretend to be exhaustive. In Bettelheim's view, the Nazis had established 4 major goals in the camps. To break the prisoners as individuals, to spread terror among the rest of the population by example, to give the Gestapo a training ground, and to create a human laboratory where the SS could gauge the maximum amount of hard labor the prisoners could withstand and minimum amount of food and medical care required to keep them alive. Bettelheim divided the inmates into new prisoners, those who had spent no more than a year in the camps, at least 3 years. He said they wished to keep their personalities intact, so that they had a good chance, if freed, of emerging much the same as when they were arrested. Old prisoners were mainly concerned with how best to cope with daily life inside the camp, had accepted their grim conditions, and were afraid of returning to the outer world. Old prisoners also tended to direct their aggression against one another, so as not to get in trouble with the guards. New prisoners aimed their aggression at their keepers, at least when they felt their angry words would not be heard. The essay's core contention was that most prisoners eventually develop types of behavior which are characteristic of infancy or early youth. To support his contention, Bettelheim wrote that the prisoners were forced to say thou to one another, which in Germany is indiscriminately used only among small children. Superscript 1 in fact. The term du was used at the time not just among small children but between lovers, good friends, and between adults and children within the family. The SS insisted that inmates use do not to make them childlike but to humiliate them, to rob them of their status as Herr Doctor or Herr Professor, or the dozens of other honorifics or titles in which Germans and Austrians put such store. Still, Bettelheim pressed his case, writing that, like children, inmates found satisfaction in daydreaming instead of action, lived always in the immediate present, fought furiously with one another 1 minute and then made up moments later, and felt no shame when they were caught exaggerating their manliness. During the day the prisoners who wanted to defecate had to obtain the permission of the guard. It seemed as if the education to cleanliness would be once more repeated. Superscript 1 new prisoners were often required to make work they regarded as childish, like digging holes in the ground with their bare hands even though tools were available, or carting stones from one end of the camp to the other and back for no useful purpose. Bettelheim argued that widespread regression to childlike behavior eventually reduced most prisoners to an undifferentiated mass and more or less willing tools of the Gestapo, whose values the inmates soon began accepting as their own. Superscript 1 squared instead of using the verbal aggressions of the sort they had employed before entering the camp. They aped the foul vocabulary of the guards. It was not unusual to find old prisoners, when in charge of others, behaving worse than the Gestapo, in some cases because they were trying to win favor, but more often because they considered this the best way to behave toward prisoners in the camp. Superscript 1 Bettelheim said that capos and block elders helped the Gestapo torture and kill inmates regarded. This was certainly true, but not because these were for metamorphosis. As Bettelheim well knew but did not say, camp officials purposely chose as capos thugs like themselves, former S-men, foreign legionnaires, and professional criminals, those who knew how to use a whip. Superscript 1 Bettelheim wrote that old prisoners eventually became so enthralled by their keepers that they tried to sew and mend their uniforms so that they would resemble those of the guards. They even copied one of the guards' favorite off-duty games, hitting a comrade to see how much punishment he could take without crying out. Bettelheim found it appalling to see how far even politically well-educated prisoners went in identifying with their captors. Superscript 1 By way of measuring this phenomenon, he said. He asked more than 100 old political prisoners the following question. If I am lucky and reach foreign soil, should I tell the story of the camp and arouse the interest of the cultured world? Superscript 1 Bettelheim did not consider, at least in the essay, that a prisoner might well pause before answering such a question in the affirmative, given that his reply could easily reverberate to the ears of his keepers. Instead, he said that only 2 inmates in his sample felt everyone escaping Germany should fight the Nazis by sounding the alarm. All others hoped for a German revolution, but rejected the notion of other countries' interference in the fatherland's internal affairs. He said these inmates even expressed their hatred of the international press when foreign correspondents tried to help them by reporting on conditions in the camps. Superscript 1 Bettelheim wrote that what happened to prisoners in Dachau and Buchenwald, the reduction of the individual to a slavish, childlike member of the group, happened in less grotesque terms to the inhabitants of Greater Germany. And he warned that it might happen to the populations of France, Belgium, Holland, and other occupied countries if they failed to organize resistance movements. He maintained that the best way to fight the Nazist systematic plan was through the formation of democratic groups in which independent and mature people reinforced one another's ability to oppose the oppressor. If such groups were not formed, it would be difficult to counter the slow process of personality disintegration. Bettelheim concluded that this disintegration should be studied by all people interested in learning what happens to the individual caught in a totalitarian regime's psychological vise, especially if those who managed to survive were to be resurrected as autonomous and self-reliant persons. Superscript 1 Bettelheim wrote that he had tried to but unfortunately participate in his investigation. Superscript 1 He said one was a doctor named Alfred Fisher, about whom he told his readers nothing save that he was now in England. The other was Ernst Federn, though Bettelheim did not risk identifying his friend at the time, because he was still in Buchenwald. He said both men were less interested than he was in exploring the psychology of camp life. Square perhaps he thought so, Federn told me. Federn, who was liberated from Buchenwald in 1945 and eventually became a social worker in the United States, wrote that in the camp he and Bettelheim had noticed the degree to which the mechanisms of defense that Sander Ferenczi and Anna Freud have described as identification with the aggressor could be observed amongst the camp inmates. Squared Superscript 1 Federn did not recall whether he or Bettelheim came up with this observation first, but Bettelheim avoided fully crediting their collaboration. Nor did he suggest anywhere in his essay that his observations owed anything to the thinking of Anna Freud and her father's close colleague Ferenczi. Federn, who was in Dachau and Buchenwald for a total of 7 years, told me that there is no question that regression of the Bettelheim described took place among some inmates, a few of whom did desperately ape the guards. But he said this phenomenon differed markedly from man to man, and called nonsense the notion that it was universal. Throughout much of his paper, Bettelheim implied that it was. Toward the end, however, the generalities seemed to make him uneasy, and he wrote that the same old prisoners who identified with the Gestapo at other moments defied it, demonstrating extraordinary courage in doing so. Squared he supplied no examples. If he had second thoughts about the many other generalities in his essay, he did not state them. He said flatly that criminals and political prisoners did not feel too badly about their incarceration. Squared cubed that none of the many inmates he talked to dreamed about the terror of the transportation to the camps. Squared that the longer a prisoner spent in the camps the less realistic were his daydreams. Squared describing a winter night when the SS forced prisoners to stand outside without overcoats for hours, during which many died of exposure or suffered frostbite that led to amputations. Bettelheim wrote, a feeling of utter indifference swept the prisoners. They did not care whether the guards shot them. They were indifferent to acts of torture committed by the guards. The guards no longer had any authority, the spell of fear and death was broken. It was again as if what happened did not really happen to oneself. There was again the split between the me to whom it happened, and an interested but detached observer. Felt free from fear and therefore were actually happier than at most other times during their camp experiences. Squared recasting this passage for a 1947 volume of the Encyclopedia Britannica, Bettelheim wrote that a quasi-orgiastic happiness spread among the prisoners. Squared he maintained, also without qualification, that the inmates neither dreamed about their ordeal nor attached particular emotions to it. Squared if he himself stood through that terrible, freezing night, he did not say In another generalization, Bettelheim wrote that prisoners deluded themselves into thinking that beneath the rough exteriors of some high camp officers a certain sympathy existed for the prisoners' plight. Squared in fact. As Ernst Fettern and other former inmates have testified, and Bettelheim himself would write, not all camp officials and guards were hell-bent on inflicting punishment. And some did try to treat the inmates with a certain decency. Cubed moreover, many of the prisoners the SS chose to put in charge of barracks and commandos, far from copying SS brutality, did the best they could in an almost impossible situation to protect their charges. Cubed superscript 1 better treatment also came through bribes. Old prisoners, Bettelheim wrote, used their money for securing for themselves soft jobs, such as work in the shops where they were at least protected against the weather while at work. Cubed squared he did not disclose that he had held such a job during his winter at Buchenwald. That he was, by his own definition, not an old prisoner at the time, or that his poor eyesight had helped protect him. Nor did he reveal that he himself had paid bribes, a disclosure that would not come for 17 more years. Bettelheim did not mention that the Gestapo freed thousands of prisoners during the 10.5 months he was incarcerated, and revealed nothing about what led to his own release. With the exception of the mysterious Alfred Fischer, he named no fellow inmate, and offered no examples of the toughness and often bravery with which many withstood the daily barbarity, or of the kindness and selflessness exhibited by some of his fellow prisoners. One such inmate was Herr Zipper in Dachau. Soon after arriving at the camp, Zipper began recruiting other musicians who, using 2 or 3 violins and guitars, plus some makeshift instruments, formed a small orchestra. They rehearsed in the barracks on Sunday afternoons, while other prisoners stood watch, and performed concerts in an unused latrine with room enough for about 25 listeners to file in at a time. They played compositions by Zipper, written late at night in the barracks latrine, which the composer had made his studio by volunteering to clean it, after a full 12-hour working day, for the duration of his stay in Dachau. Sitting among the toilets, he wrote on margin strips of Nazi propaganda newspapers, cut and pasted together for him by patrons of the concerts. Zipper told me that Bettelheim's writing on the camps unfairly accented the meanness of the guards and prisoners, and not just because it ignored his own behavior. He recalled a man named Tillinger, a poor, uneducated Jew who barely had managed to eke out a living running a small grocery shop in Vienna. In Dachau, Tillinger made it his daily crusade to counsel his fellow inmates to persevere, and especially to reject the option of suicide. This 50-year-old storekeeper, who could hardly read, became the little hero of the barracks. Cubed, Bettelheim found no room in his account for such stories. In his determination to be the objective scholar, he made himself omniscient and his comrades, if not invisible, identityless stick figures whose sole purpose was to support his scientific findings. Yet Bettelheim's prose was less clinically neutral than eerily detached and superior, as if he had not been a prisoner at all but had merely hovered over Dachau and Buchenwald taking mental notes. What he saw when he looked down were prisoners he seemed to hold in contempt, men he called pathological liars, unable to restrain themselves, unable to make objective evaluations, etc., having implied with his etc. that these pathetic creatures manifested other weaknesses as well. Bettelheim then posed what he regarded as the central question for his survival. How can I protect myself against becoming as they are? His answer, he said, was to study these guinea pigs to find out what was happening to them and to him. An intellectual exercise that also would allow him to occupy his spare time with interesting problems. This tone would characterize much of Bettelheim's writing about his fellow prisoners over the years, but occasionally a certain self-aware 1947, writing about the concentration camp as a class state. He said that looking down upon lower-class prisoners was an important psychological defense against one's own fears. When the essay appeared in the fall of 1943. With World War II at full pitch in the Pacific and Europe, and reports of the Nazi crematoriums mounting monthly, Its omniscient voice riveted readers. Few of them had access to any other perspective on the camp experience, and they were disinclined to question the views of a man who had suffered as Bettelheim had while they had sat safely an ocean away debating whether even to go to war against Hitler. Meyer Shapiro, the Columbia University art historian, was so struck by extreme situations that he pressed it on several friends, among them the author James T. Farrell, whose starkly realistic Studs Lonergan trilogy, about an Irish-American youth growing up in Chicago, had been a major literary event of the 1930s. Farrell found the essay a brilliant study, cubed and soon told Bettelheim so, beginning an on-and-off correspondence that would last 10 years. Extreme situations also impressed Dwight MacDonald, the sometime Trotskyist, pacifist, and anarchist who had just quit as an editor at Partisan Review to found his own publication, Politics.
In the first issue of this soon-to-be influential magazine of the left, MacDonald called attention to the essay, and then wrote its author, praising him and inviting him to expand on the subject of concentration camps for the new journal. Superscript 37 Bettelheim was duly flattered, but replied that he was too busy to write anything new on his camp experience. Moreover, he was applying for U.S. citizenship, during which process the government barred him from any actions that would influence U.S. politics. Superscript 38 Bettelheim suggested that MacDonald excerpt extreme situations in politics, which he did, introducing it in July 1944 with an announcement that identified Bettelheim as a psychiatrist. In a handwritten letter, Bettelheim politely corrected his new admirer. "I am not a psychiatrist. I am only a psychologist. I just feel that one should not make claim to a professional standing which one does not have." Superscript 3 Extreme situations also attracted the notice of a number of prominent emigres, leftist intellectuals like Theodore Adorno and Max Horkheimer, who used FDR for show, organized a series of lectures on National Socialism, the final one touching on Bettelheim's essay. The session's theme was that fascism produced something similar to a psychological collapse in the inmates of concentration camps, and analysis had heralded the Frankfurters' bleak view of mass culture and its lobotomizing effect on the public. For degrees Leo Lowenthal, the German sociologist and a prime mover at the Institute, would soon quote Bettelheim's essay liberally and approvingly in the new political and intellectual organ of the American Jewish Committee, the monthly called Commentary. Abstracts of references to extreme situations appeared in several other publications, including the Journal of the American Medical Association for Superscript 1, and it would soon be anthologized and hailed as a classic psychological study, to become required reading on many campuses for at least 2 decades. Early on, Bettelheim began saying that General Dwight D. Eisenhower had made the essay required reading for U.S. military government officers in GR. Many, a claim likely based on a letter from Gordon Allport, who had first published Extreme Situations in the Journal of Abnormal and Social Psychology, saying that Eisenhower had sought reprint permission from him. For superscript 2, neither the Eisenhower Library nor U.S. Army historians can find any evidence that the general followed through and that Extreme Situations was ever used by the military in post-war Europe. By 1944, Bettelheim had developed a growing reputation at the University of Chicago as something of a Renaissance man, whose rigorous classical education at the Realschule and the University of Vienna and the breadth of his reading had supplied him with an impressive depth of knowledge. As with other emigres who had begun attracting attention at American colleges and universities, his thick accent and intellectual exoticism gave him star potential in an insecure land where Europe equaled better. Even though Mary Ashby Sheep had refused to rehire Bettelheim, she gave him the highest marks for his teaching of art history, psychology, and philosophy at Rockford. Ralph Tyler, too, continued to be impressed by his protege, whose byline had appeared not just in Politics, along with those of George Orwell, Paul Goodman, Simone Weil, Daniel Bell, Meyer Shapiro, and MacDonald himself, but in other publications as well. In reviewing a book for the College Art Journal, Bettelheim criticized the author for making his text forbidding for the college student by using the clot tech language of philosophy when simpler terms could have expressed more clearly what he had in mind. For superscript 3, this impatience with obfuscation would become the hallmark of Bettelheim's teaching, and over the years his commitment to accessible if not always honest prose would set us, and writing turned out by others in the profession he would win. Accomplishments during his first 5 years in the United States played nicely on the Austrian stage. The erstwhile lumber dealer had carpentered for himself, with its splendid backdrop of polymath achievements. 14 years at the University of Vienna, studies with Arnold Schoenberg, summa cum laude in 3 disciplines, 2 books published, training in all fields of psychology, and membership in an organization that studied the emotional problems of children and adolescents. Ironically, Bettelheim invented these credentials needlessly. America was not Europe, where lack of status so often suffocated ambition. Anyone with wit and drive could get ahead in the land of opportunity, as thousands of Jews had. Moreover, from its founding in 1892, the University of Chicago had never been as stuffy about faculty appointments as the Ivy League bastions of class and privilege, with their Danish emulation of Cambridge and Oxford and their gentlemanly anti-Semitism. Chicago was far less hostile to Jews, in part because its first president, William Rainey Harper, had been a distinguished Hebrew scholar. If anything, Chicago in the 1940s had more in common with the great German universities before the rise of Hitler, where the search for truth was the highest academic goal. Robert Maynard Hutchins and his disciples believed that education was an end in itself and needed no excuse for existence. The chancellor regarded credentials as less important than how smart a person was and how well he taught. In a very profound sense, recalled the Chicago dean, they didn't give a damn where you got your education as long as you were educated. 44 Still, it didn't hurt if that learning had been acquired on the Ringstrasse and carried the aura of psychoanalysis. Bettelheim had arrived in a land where the cause so transfixed the populace that in 1941 the singing Annalise Sange and her dreams start on Broadway in Lady in the Dark. Hutchins and Adler's Great Books project began with Homer and marched along the shelf through Plato, Aristotle, Aquinas, Shakespeare, Kant, and Darwin, the final volume Sanctifying Civilization and Its Discontents, and 17 other works by Freud. As W.H. Auden had eulogized in 1939, Freud had become less a person than a whole climate of opinion. 45 Peter Biles, like Bettelheim the Viennese refugee, was astounded by the enthusiastic reception he received as a novice analyst, and would come to see in the open opportunity the profession offered in America the parallel to Frederick Jackson Turner's frontier thesis, suggesting that perhaps the covered wagon had been replaced by the couch. 46 Despite this receptive atmosphere, Bettelheim seemed compelled to continue fabricating. He started saying he hated Patricia Lynn during the 7 years she had lived with by his former wife and by Patsy's analyst, editor, or far more often obliterating them altogether. Once he discovered that no one challenged this useful new achievement, he began polishing it to a higher sheen. In The Informed Heart 1960 he wrote that he had lived with 2 autistic children in Vienna as part of their treatment. 47 In The Empty Fortress 1967-48 he made the same claim, as he did when interviewed by Newsweek after the book came out. I became fascinated with their problems, he told the magazine. 4 In Surviving and Other Essays 1979, he wrote that he had worked and lived with some autistic children before the Anschluss. 5 Degrees in a Good Enough Parent 1987, he wrote that by employing what he regarded as sound child-rearing practices based on psychoanalytic principles, he had tried to heal one and, for some time, 2 autistic children who lived with him in his home for many years. 5 Superscript 1 Sometimes he told the story as if daring those closest to him to catch him out. In A Home for the Heart 1974 he conflated his first and second wives, before our own children were born. My wife and I brought in a child who suffered from infantile autism, a hopeless case, in order to find out whether psychoanalysis could help her. Something within the little girl, and within myself, made me become deeply involved with her. 5 Superscript 2 Patricia Lynn was the only child the Bettelheims took into their home in Vienna, and she was never diagnosed as autistic. She could not have been by any disturb, who treated her in the 1930s, because it was not until 1943 that the term autism was coined by the Johns Hopkins psychiatrist Ewen Cameron to describe the condition of small children trapped inside their thoughts and unable to relate to the world around them. Though Patsy was by no means normal, I don't think she was what you can call autistic, said Gina, the view shared by Emery Noach Hartman, who, with her friend Trude Weinfeld, had taught at the Vienna Montessori school that Patsy eventually attended. Unlike most autistic children, Patsy was able to manage certain complex actions by herself, like taking the tram to and from school each day. Most autistic children do not speak at all, or utter words and sounds that make little or no sense to the listener. Patsy, though withdrawn, was speaking coherently when she arrived in Vienna, which was what made it possible for Etta Disturb to try to help her 3 times a week with the talking cure. Bettelheim would eventually write that Patsy had been virtually mute all her life and that she was eye for a year and a half. He played with her, a combination of peek-a-boo and Will's the baby, in which he pretended not to see her and then would discover her. He wrote that as the game progressed over the weeks she took increasing delight in it and finally began allowing him to hug her when he found her. It was during one of these affectionate embraces that she uttered her first sentence, which was, "Give me the skeleton of George Washington." Bettelheim explained the sentence by stating that the tragedy of Patsy's life had originated in the fact that her father was completely unknown. Not just to her, but also to her mother. In her sentence, she told that what she needed was a father, and as an American girl with no known father, she could think only of the father of her country as a solution to her problem. Since the unknown father was the skeleton in the closet of her life, she asked for his skeleton. By superscript 3, Patsy may well have longed for her father, but if so it was most likely because she did remember him, as did her mother. Patsy was not the child of a one-night stand her mother had had while drunk. As Bettelheim would tell one interviewer. 54 Her father, Elmer Wardwin, had married Agnes Peel on September 19, 1922, and their daughter was born 18 months later. The couple divorced in 1928. When Patsy was 4 years old. 55 The Patsy card greatly strengthened the hand whom had dealt himself in the early 1940s. Ralph Tyler and others in the university community believed that not only did this hard-working newcomer have strong credentials in psychology from the University of Vienna, but that he had treated at least one emotionally disturbed child in his home for several years, a child who, at least in some tellings, suffered from the newly named affliction of autism. Bettelheim wrote that it was because of his experience with this autistic child that the university asked him to take charge of its home for emotionally troubled children, the Orthogenic School. 56 The Orthogenic School had been in operation in one form or another since 1912. When Rush Medical College, then affiliated with the University of Chicago, had established a clinic to treat children of doubtful mentality and to instruct medical students in handling such patients. 57 In the mid-1920s, the school had attracted the attention of Charles Hubbard Judd, who had run the psychology laboratory at Yale University and under whom Ralph Tyler had gotten his doctorate at the University of Chicago, where Judd became chairman of the Department of Education in 1909. Judd was interested in establishing the program to explore the development of abnormal children, believing, Tyler told me, that in this area you didn't go to books to learn but to where the phenomenon was. Biogenic School had moved through 3 unsatisfactory years, became part of the university that year, and settled permanently at 60th Street and Dorchester Avenue, in a 3-story, red brick Georgian building that had belonged to the St. Paul Universalist Church. To oversee the school, Judd chose an ambitious Chicagoan named Mondell Sherman, who held a medical degree from Rush and a doctorate in experimental psychology from the university and taught educational psychology. Sherman would remain in charge for more than a decade, working with the school's principal, Helen Mansfield Robinson, a psychologist and reading specialist. They presided over an enrollment of about 30 children, most of whom lived at the school full-time. Their diagnoses ranged from generalized emotional problems and reading disabilities to epilepsy and mental retardation. On average, these disparate and difficult children stayed at the school less than a year, Thus Sherman and Robinson placed a good deal of emphasis on helping them make the transition to other schools. Sherman's main interest was research. He established a laboratory on the premises for psychological testing and committee to look into the causes of reading disabilities. The school also conducted neurological examinations, sometimes attaching wires to the heads of the children to take electroencephalograph readings for brain wave studies. By the early 1940s, serious criticisms of Sherman's stewardship were being raised by both university officials and the parents of some of the children at the school. 58 The complaints were that the children were not getting any better, recalled Ralph Tyler, who in 1939 had succeeded his mentor, Charles Judd, as head of the Department of Education, which oversaw the school. Sherman also was unable or unwilling to control many of his young residents, whose destructive behavior frequently created chaos at the institution. 5 Tyler had already appointed the faculty committee to investigate the school and make recommendations for its future. And in a report that ran 6 double-spaced pages, the committee worried most about the school's educational shortcomings, citing its inadequate teaching equipment, its lack of an indoor gymnasium, and the teachers' low pay. The report urged the expansion of the school's research program, suggesting that Sherman be put in charge of a special interdisciplinary committee to that end. As for the school's eclectic therapeutic program, the report called it sound, a finding that may have owed something to the presence of Mondale Sherman on the committee. 6 degrees. Despite the report, criticism of the school continued, including charges in some circles that Sherman was at times horribly sadistic. 6 superscript 1 By 1944, one of the principal fundraisers lamented that the school was in such financial distress that it no longer could nourish. 6 superscript to Tyler, and he unexpectedly announced that he planned to leave Chicago and go into private practice in Los Angeles. Over the years, Bruno Bettelheim told his family and several others the following story of the events that led up to what happened next. In 1942, Ralph Tyler had asked Bettelheim to draw up a memorandum on the orthogenic school, but Bettelheim ignored the request. He was reluctant to tell his mentor that he thought the school was such a dump that it should be burned down. He said the place was dirty and stank of urine. Several months later, when Tyler pressed him for the report, he confessed his views, which only made Tyler more eager for his thoughts on how to rescue the school. Bettelheim made it clear he had no interest in running the home, but agreed to write the memorandum. In putting it together, he sought the help of his emigre neighbor Emil Sylvester, who held a medical degree from the University of Vienna, had worked in that city's children's hospital, and recently had become a certified psychiatrist in Chicago, specializing in the treatment of children. Bettelheim said they drew on the work of their fellow Viennese Auguste Eichhorn, who had applied psychoanalytic understanding to child development and was widely known for his 1925 book Wer war das Jugend, Wayward Youth, for which Sigmund Freud had written the foreword. Eichhorn believed, the more the life of the institution conforms to an actual social community, the more certain is the social rehabilitation of the child. 6 cubed his approach, combining permissiveness with large doses of understanding, met with mixed success as he treated the delinquents he took in at Aubert Horab Run, the home he had developed after World War I for these sometimes dangerously aggressive youths. Bettelheim said that the memorandum also leaned on the ideas of his friend Fritz Rettel, who had studied with Eichhorn in Vienna, and who would apply some of his techniques in 1946, when he started a home called Pioneer House in Detroit. Bettelheim told Karen Raines, his literary agent, that in drawing up the report for Tyler he also was heavily influenced by what he had learned in caring for 2 autistic children in his Vienna home. 64 A few weeks after Bettelheim delivered the memorandum, Tyler invited him to lunch at the Quadrangle Club, the university's vine-covered faculty sanctuary. Tyler, who was something of a raconteur, kept his protege entertained with jokes and stories, but dessert and coffee came and went with not a word about the report. After lunch, his host asked Bettelheim to walk him to his office, but Tyler guided him instead into the chancellor's office, where the memorandum lay on Robert Hutchins's desk. Bettelheim said that Hutchins liked his ideas and asked him to take over the school. The refugee angrily protested that he had agreed, but said he knew that but wanted Bettelheim to take the job anyway. There followed a good deal of flattery and cajoling by both Tyler and Hutchins, who finally asked for Bettelheim's conditions. He was so annoyed that he decided to make demands he assumed they would never meet, tripling the orthogenic school's budget, and no questions asked or answered for 5 years. Bettelheim said his patrons huddled for a moment and then Hutchins declared the conditions fair. 65 No version of the memorandum exists in the Bettelheim orthogenic school papers at the University of Chicago, nor is it among Emil Sylvester's papers in California. Whether or not Bettelheim actually wrote the memorandum, and regardless of whether it led to the climactic scene in the Chancellor's office, there is no question that Ralph Tyler wanted him to take over the orthogenic school. And at least one other influential faculty member may have put in a good word for him with Hutchins. University lore holds that Joe Schwab, the biology teacher and great books enthusiast who had been at the 8-year study bowl session when Bettelheim dismissed Hutchins's favorite project, admired the emigrate's outspokenness and told Hutchins so. 66 Despite these endorsements, the candidate remained reluctant. Ort Middledorf, the head of the art department, who had called Bettelheim a brilliant man in recommending him to Rockford, had held out the possibility of making him an assistant professor of humanities, with emphasis on teaching art history. It was a job for which his credentials and training were far stronger than they were for running a home for emotionally disturbed children, and the post appealed to him. But Middledorf could not yet make an offer, and the orthogenic school proposal was there for the taking. By the fall of 1944, Bettelheim needed a steady job more than ever. His daughter, Ruth, was now almost 2, and he and Trude were trying to have a second child. After some agonizing, he finally bowed to Tyler's blandishments and, on October 1st, became principal of the orthogenic school, with a 1-year contract at a salary of $3,600. Looking back at the decision near the end of his life, Bettelheim said that the school he inherited was a shambles, full of children the community regarded as hopeless cases. Because of this, if he failed no one would really blame him, but if he succeeded everyone would be more than pleased. So it was a no-lose situation, which I liked. 67